And now we come to the point from which the translation became controversial. Yet you will notice that it is the use of intellectual endeavor that is relevant, not my gender. If a Muslim jurist had come up with the same arguments and logical reasoning, the 1400-year-plus mistake would be more readily admitted and changed. Not only is the language of the Sublime Quran translation inclusive rather than exclusive, the translation also reverts the translation of chapter 4, verse 34, back to the way the Prophet understood it, as shown to us through his behavior. The part of chapter 4, verse 34 in question is more or less read in all present English translations as, "Those husbands who fear disobedience on the part of their wives, first admonish them, then abandon their sleeping places, then beat them." My position is that the understanding of this verse must revert back to the interpretation given to it by the Prophet Muhammad, peace and the mercy of God be upon him, through his actions. He never beat anyone, much less any of his wives. If there was any marital discord, he went away. Anyone who claims to follow the sunnah of the Prophet must do the same thing, because the sunnah of the Prophet is not to beat, hit, hurt, spank, or chastise any woman. The word idrabu is a command, an imperative form of the verb, yet a command that the Prophet did not carry out if it means to beat. But he did carry it out when it means go away. Therefore, the sunnah of the Prophet is not to beat. The word zaraba, or its imperative form in verb form 1, idrabu, has 25 meanings. Why take a meaning that goes against the legal and moral principles of the Quran that harms someone when the Prophet did not do it? The most conclusive arguments in Islamic tradition to prove or disprove something is using the Quran to prove another point in the Quran. This I will do. I will show how the previous erroneous interpretations of idrabu creates a contradiction, not in the Quran itself. Two premises. First of all, marriage is encouraged in Islam as a moral act. The Blessed Prophet said, marriage is half of faith. Secondly, divorce is discouraged as an immoral act, but necessary, allowed, but if necessary, allowed. The Blessed Prophet said, divorce is deplorable. Now we get to the heart of the main reason why the word beat is a misinterpretation. We read in chapter 2, verse 231, quote, "When you divorce wives, and they are about to reach their term, then hold them, the wives, back honorably, or set them, the wife or wives, free honorably, but hold them not back by injuring them so that you commit aggression." In other words, the Quran is telling husbands not to harm their wives who want to be set free, not to hold them back by injuring them. The word injuring, darar, also means hurt, harm, use force, or commit aggression. Let's take an example. A Muslim wife, after many attempts to help her husband manage his inappropriate anger that most often is taken out against her, tells her husband that she wants a divorce, or that she agrees to a divorce. He, in his anger, does not at that moment remember that according to 2:231, he is not to hold back by injuring a wife who wants to be set free, and instead, being both judge and jury, beats her, as allowed in 434, because of the misinterpretation. The battered wife, becoming the victim of his anger, is then afraid to speak out again, as the last instance has caused her to seek refuge in a shelter for battered women. Therefore, we see a disconnect between chapter 4, verse 34, and chapter 2, verse 231. Jurists have created a contradiction that is not in the Quran by encouraging divorce and discouraging marriage. So we can conclude a Muslim woman who wants a divorce or who agrees to a divorce must be set free without injuring, hurting, or using force against her. But a Muslim woman who wants to remain married does so under the threat of being beaten. If Muslim wives knew their rights, which one would want to stay married under such circumstances? Does this make sense? Is this encouraging marriage? 434, as presently interpreted, contradicts 231. How can we eliminate this contradiction? There is a very simple solution. Revert the interpretation back to how the Blessed Prophet understood it through his behavior, his sirah. It has been a great blessing that the Sublime Quran is the first translation to use go away instead of beat in the English translation. We are told that the word beat in this verse, 434, is a transitive verb. That means it can only take a direct object. As this verb is transitive, it can only mean beat. When it is in the intransitive form, it means go away from them, when making them an indirect object, because you have to use the word from. There are two arguments against this rationalization of an immoral act. First of all, we have to ask, when this verse was revealed to the Blessed Prophet and he heard the word idrabu, that jurists and commentators have said for over 1400 years means beat, did he sit back and discuss within himself whether the verb that God was revealing was a transitive one or an intransitive one? No. By his behavior, we know that he understood it to mean go away from them, his wives. Otherwise, we would have to conclude, God forbid, that the prophet did not understand the Quran as well as the later legal jurists do who make this distinction. Secondly, we're talking about translation, not about the original Arabic, which is the eternal word of God. When you translate from an original text into a target language, you have to go with the rules of the target language. There are many times when an English word requires an indirect object, whereas the Arabic word does not. Do you then distort the meaning? No, you go to the target language. Since the word them in the verse, in order to use go away in English, you have to say go away from them, adding the word from, which then makes this object indirect. This is why the jurists say it has to mean beat them or hit them. However, in English, we could say leave them, and we would be following the grammar of the jurists, but perhaps implying more than what the prophet understood. We have to ask ourselves, why did the prophet not beat his wives, even though it was a command in the Quran? First of all, when the verse was revealed to him, it appears from his behavior in the same type of situation that he did not consider it to mean beat them, referring to his wives. It might possibly be because the Quran uses 3 other words for strike or beat, namely in chapter 28, verse 15, in chapter 38, verse 41, and in chapter 51, verse 29.